Hey everybody, welcome again to another week of Skeptic Skeleton Sunday streams. This week I've got a two-parter, a bit, like I do every week. Starting off with our usual, religious questioning and video of why Christianity is right, specifically. After which, I think we'll go into a bit more social issues because a big theme behind or a big reason behind creating this channel was not just to challenge skepticism as it pertains to religion, but also as it pertains to everything, including social issues. And I won't give away the videos just yet, but we have two kind of spicy videos aimed at children and racism. Two things that absolutely go together. Anyway, let's get started with our first video. Why is Christianity right? Also, I will be checking the chat every few minutes or so. So if I take a pause and click away or a long pause, that's what that is.
It seems like they all have a common thread of answering the question which seems to plague us all, which is what happens to us when we die. It's the one question I think that a lot of us have difficulty with because we cannot answer it. And so it seems like this common thread is it gives us hope for the afterlife, something better than what we have right now. And if you'll
I'm not convinced that, and I know this guy isn't the guy I'm responding to, but I'm not convinced that that is necessarily a good thing. I've never quite understood the benefit of the afterlife as a concept. I've never understood the benefit of eternal life as a concept, as a matter of fact. I don't understand why someone would want to live forever or what inherent benefit comes from that. And if you would, well, you'd be happy every minute of every moment, then to that I would say that's not me. I'm happy every minute of every moment, and you are depriving me of the full spectrum of human experiences by forcing me to be happy for all of time and beyond. I just don't get it. Personally, putting aside the evidence and or I don't understand the appeal or the relief that comes from any particular description of an afterlife.
I feel like a lot of religions that what they do is they put forth codes or rules of conduct to help us so that we can achieve this afterlife. And so given this commonality, what makes you believe that Christianity is the correct or right religion?
Great question. And your name is?
Suketu.
Spell that for me.
Suketu.
Suketu. I think you've asked a very, very important question. First of all, let me qualify it a little bit, and I'm sure you already know that not all religions talk about an afterlife, mainly the monotheistic ones do. The pantheistic ones are reincarnation. Even the reincarnation between Buddhism and Hinduism is a little different. In Hinduism is the transference of identity one into another in a different form. But in Buddhism, it's not even sure whether it's the identity that's transmigrated or just another form of essence that has emerged. A worldview is built not on one line of argument. A world is built on a connected series of arguments.
No, I would argue against that. Now, probably the justification for a worldview is built on a connected series of arguments, but worldviews typically are not developed in that way. And perhaps that's not what he meant by built, but that's the only thing I can imagine that he meant. When building a worldview, most people do not typically assess arguments. They usually assess their experiences and the things around them and the information around them, information of which might not necessarily come in the form of an argument. So a lot of people come to the conclusion of Christianity and that worldview, not because they looked at any formalized arguments, most of the time because they were raised that way and they were raised in a community that was raised that way, and it just made sense to them. I am not willing to believe that most people of most worldviews have considered arguments for their worldviews before coming to the worldview.
And if a worldview is just built on one line of argument, I think this is the mistake naturalism often makes. It'll take sort of one argument that it has in its favor and forget all the myriad other questions that emerge. When I look at the person and the work of Jesus Christ, this is the most important question I had to ask. Now, granted, I asked it in reverse fashion because I was on a bed of suicide. A Bible was brought to me, and I prayed a prayer of desperation. I grant you that. I just had no hope. But I was read the verse, Jesus said, because I live, you also shall live. I just said, this is talking about a life that I don't have.
As an aside, I don't understand why that phrase in particular would dissuade someone from pursuing suicide. Now, whatever keeps you alive is whatever keeps you alive. I'm just a little curious as to why that phrase in particular would change someone's mind if they are really struggling with suicide to hear someone else say that they're alive, so you'll be alive. I don't understand how that then changes your perspective if you are suicidal.
And maybe this is the life I need. And so I prayed that prayer, but then I made a prayer commitment right on that bed. I was 17, and I said, Jesus, if you're who you claim to be, I will leave no stone unturned in my pursuit of truth.
So this is an important thing to touch on because as he seems to be describing his progression to Christianity, it seems very warped and confusing to me, as if he's not going through a proper investigative process. So when he was brought with this verse, rather than do the investigation first, he prayed first to something that he didn't know was there, and then prayed that he would continue to search for the thing that he did not know exists. And I don't understand how one intellectually does that without conceding the existence of the thing that they're looking for. If you are praying to Jesus, you believe in Jesus and you believe in his ability to answer your prayer. Otherwise, you are talking into the void, knowingly talking into the void. I don't understand how you talk to someone you don't know is there. And I also don't understand how you then make a commitment to someone you don't know is there that you will find them if they are there. And if you make that commitment, what if they're not there? What if you turn over every stone and they're not there? And why is it necessary for you to turn over every single stone in order to disprove Jesus's existence rather than Jesus, who presumably cares about you and your salvation, to present himself in the evidence that would convince you? I don't think the burden is on you to falsify the existence of Jesus. I think the burden, if Jesus existed, would be on him to justify or prove his existence. And that's what I mean when I say warped. It just seems very backwards to me that the first thing a non-believer would do to discover if a religion was true was to pray about it and make a commitment of prayer.
Because my goal was truth. Pragmatically, it made sense for me to hang on to a life jacket that was thrown my way. But then I began my years and years and years of study.
So what you're saying is you took the first life jacket that was thrown your way, regardless of whether or not it was true, and then you investigated afterwards. You got to the conclusion before you did the investigation and then worked backwards. Do you not see how that influenced your investigation, or at least could have? Do you not see how that could have influenced your investigation to such a strong degree that rather than actually looking for the truth, you made up the truth, or you perceive the evidence in such a ways that it supported what you already thought was true? This is why you are not supposed to go into any sort of experiment or investigation having already decided what the conclusion is, because that interferes with your ability to objectively look at the facts as they are and follow them. If you have decided the conclusion is 5, then you are going to warp and try to justify 2 plus 2 in some sort of way that it makes sense that it equals 5. However, regardless of how much you try to warp it to yourself and how you started with the conclusion before you actually did the math, that doesn't mean the math will make sense. And that doesn't mean that the math will lead you to that conclusion. It just means you've convinced yourself that it will lead you to that conclusion.
When you look at the life of Christ from the prophetic schema of hundreds of years before, where he was going to be born, what he was going to do, what his name was going to be called, how the manner of birth was, the manner of life he was going to lead, how he was going to die, and then the resurrection from the dead. The uniqueness about the New Testament or Old Testament scriptures, it's not a single author. It's multiple authors. As you know, 66 books, 40 different authors have edited it, and it is interesting.
I really want to know how you got the number of authors that wrote the books. I'm not sure, at least in my research or my experience thus far on the subject, I haven't been able to get a concrete specific number about how many authors there were. Yet somehow you've gotten one very specific answer, and I really want to know how, especially since the authors in the Gospels do not address themselves as such. In the Gospel of Mark, Luke, Matthew, John, the Gospels do not, the authors do not address themselves and say what their names are. So it's not as if you could tell from that how many authors there were of however many books. So I'm really curious how you got that number. But even more so, putting that to the side, I don't see how any of this is relevant. We can put the evidence of how you know any of the stuff in the Bible happened. We can put that to the side for now because that's a given. But it doesn't really matter. Even if everything happened as it was said to have happened, does that mean that the conclusions are justified? If a man shows up and start doing magic tricks in front of you, does that mean he's God because he said he's God and he did magic tricks that you can't explain? Because essentially that's what the Gospels, as far as I can tell, are. Jesus doing magic tricks and saying he's God while doing magic tricks that no one can explain. And I don't think that's good enough, and I don't understand why you think magic tricks are good enough to prove God, assuming that they actually are in fact magic to begin with.
That Paul, Saul of Tarsus, who wrote 1/3 of it, came in a reverse fashion to the rest of them. The disciples came birth, life, death, resurrection, and that's how they knew Jesus. Not so with Saul, who became Paul. He said when he was encountered the risen Christ, he said that I may know him, the power of the resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death. He started with the resurrection, but he said he needed to understand the cross.
Huh?
Because he came in reverse chronological order, but he encountered the risen Christ. The conversion of Saul of Tarsus and Thomas, especially, these two dramatic conversions, are powerful witnesses of what happened.
No, they're not. People convert all the time, and people deconvert all the time. You just named two people who converted and called them powerful conversions. But I can find a whole bunch of deconversions, but that wouldn't make your point any less valid. If conversions make your points better, then deconversions should make your points worse. And I don't think that you would concede that me deconverting or anyone else deconverting somehow makes Christianity less likely to be true. Yet for some reason, because Paul converted, that makes it more likely to be true. It's not as if he had a bias and he wrote these things after he was converted. But okay.
Saul, who was killing them, he was standing there watching Stephen being martyred and kept the clothes of those who were stoning him. Thomas, who said, I'm not going to believe until I see the resurrected Christ myself. And he went to India where there are 330 million deities.
And he saw the risen Christ in India? Because that's what it seems like you're implying, even though that's not what happened.
And he went and preached the gospel of Jesus and paid with his own life. That kind of dramatic transformation took place not because of just one event, but a connected series of events.
So says you. People change their beliefs and change their religion all the time for a wide variety of reasons. But just because they change their beliefs or change their religion does not mean that they did so for any good reason. And you're really trying to push the fact that these people who were not believers became believers, and it's so amazing, but you're going to ignore the fact that so many people who were powerful believers are now powerful non-believers, and that's just not as impressive.
So, here's the bottom line. A worldview is built around 4 questions: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny.
Now, if you paid attention to my last stream, he brought up these questions before, and I was hoping that we would get an answer as to how Christianity answers these questions. So hopefully in this one, he actually does. Again, I try to do these streams live, so I don't know yet.
Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And there are 3 tests for truth: logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and experiential relevance.
What does what does experiential relevance have to do with anything? A lot of some people have a lot of people have experiential relevance that does not make their beliefs true. As a matter of fact, I don't even see how it contributes to truth, given how one's experiences can be completely opposite to what reality actually is. As lots of people who have had hallucinations or illusions or been on drugs will attest.
Logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and experiential relevance. 3 tests for 4 questions. And
why? Why is this the particular structure that you're using to investigate this with? It all seems very roundabout. Those questions that you mentioned, the 4 questions, seem arbitrary and don't seem to have anything to do with truth in and of itself, as if something can insufficiently, whatever that means, answer all of those questions and still be true. Primarily, I don't understand why you would be concerned with anything else besides logical coherence and empiricism. Anything else seems unnecessary when evaluating whether or not something is true. So I don't understand why these 4 questions are so important to him.
And when you take the prophecy of Christ hundreds of years before from his virgin birth, you take the purity of his life unmatched.
Purity of his life? What was pure about him? First of all, let's ignore the fact that we but completely skip Jesus's childhood, at least if you're following the canonical books of the Bible. Hintity hint hint, there are non-canonical books of the Bible. I encourage everyone to go search them out. But if you're just paying attention to the canonical books of the Bible, which humans decided which were canonical and which weren't, we kind of skip Jesus's beginning of life. So you're saying that his life is pure, despite the fact that a large, significant chunk of it is just straight up missing. And even then, I'm not convinced that it actually is pure just because you've said so. You've given no indication or no good reason to indicate that Jesus's life is pure, and you're a follower of Jesus, so you obviously have a bias. Of course you think his life was pure. How do you demonstrate that to someone else who is not a believer? How do you demonstrate to them that Jesus actually had a pure life? Because you could say this if this was a believer, but then that would defeat the purpose of the entire question. So, all of that hugabaloo said, can you demonstrate the purity of his life to someone else who's not already a believer, despite the fact that a significant portion of his life is just straight up missing from the canonical Bibles?
Totally unmatched till this very day.
So says the believer of Jesus.
Then the death that he promised for the forgiveness of sins.
Anyone can promise death and then get themselves killed. That's not particularly impressive. Lots of people, even of other religions, promise death and then bring about that promise. That doesn't necessarily make the thing that they believe true or the thing that they advocate for true. That doesn't even make that an actual prophecy of any sort. So I don't see that as remarkable or noteworthy in any regard, that a person said they were going to die and then did things to ensure that they did in fact die.
And then the resurrection.
The alleged resurrection, which is something you would have to demonstrate before we grant that.
An Easterner, I asked.
But even if we granted the resurrection, at most, that gets you to necromancy, not godhood. Because you can be a necromancer. I mean, if we're opening the Pandora's box of supernatural explanations, why couldn't Jesus just be a necromancer with other magical abilities as opposed to a god himself? If you're willing to accept the possibility of Jesus being God, then you also would be willing to accept the possibility of Jesus just being a magical wizard or whatever. And I don't see any reason to pick one over the other. At most, resurrecting yourself from the dead proves that you can resurrect yourself from the dead, if that's even sufficiently proven. But it doesn't prove you're a god. It doesn't prove that you're a deity. It doesn't prove that you died for the sake of sin. All it proves is that you were dead and now you're alive.
Myself this question. When Jesus was asked how he was going to demonstrate it, if he were a fake, he would have said, I'm going to spiritually rise again.
Is that not what he said? Or are you getting into a semantics thing?
And they would never be able to falsify it. But he said, I'm bodily going to rise again. That is an empirically falsifiable dictum. All they would have had to show was the body and say, where is he? You said he was going to rise again. So it's in the whole schema of the prophetic corpus, the hundreds of years.
Do you think that someone can be a fake and also half do things? Because there are scams that work in a very similar way, where they scam you in a way where they're technically telling you the truth, but not telling you the entirety of the truth. So if you give us this money, we will give you this product to sell to other people and you will make money. That might technically not be inaccurate, but the way the scam is set up is that you will never sell enough product to earn back the money that you initially invested to begin with. That's how the scam works, which is just, I'm using that as an example. The point is that that's not technically a lie. That's not technically them being fake, but they're also not telling the truth while also giving something empirical.
The multiple authors pointing towards the same person from it.
Multiple authors, of whom were anonymous for all intents and purposes, and from all accounts were believers who had a vested interest and bias in their story being true. But do go on.
His virgin birth, to the purity of his life, to the
Alleged virgin birth. Also, I don't get the randomness of some of these prophecies. Why was any of this necessary that he be born of a virgin? Can he not be born of a virgin? Is it impossible for him to be born regularly and also God? Because the way that people tend to speak about the virgin birth is as if it's such a key importance to Jesus being God, when it really isn't, because God can be whatever he wants to be for whatever reasons he wants to be, if he actually is all powerful. So the virgin birth was by no means necessary. So it happening or not happening doesn't really matter, because Jesus still could have been God even if it didn't happen, right?
death on the cross for forgiveness, when he said, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing.
That doesn't make sense to me on multiple levels. So Jesus, who is God, is talking to himself, telling himself what he already knows, because he's all knowing, that people don't know what they're doing, which he already knew. So he told himself something that he already knew as he died while also being in heaven. Make it make sense.
And then the resurrection again. My 4 questions are answered correspondingly with truth on specific questions, and coherently when all of the questions are put together and answers are given.
There are a lot of coherent lies, so I don't know if coherence is as strong as you're making it out to be. And I have very, very, very high doubts that you will actually get into the empiricism of the truth of those things. But you're not done. Video's halfway done. Let's see what else you got.
So to me, first of all religions are not the same. They are actually, people say they're fundamentally the same, superficially different. Actually, they're fundamentally different, and at best superficially similar.
Yes, again, we went over this in the last stream. That's a thing he says, but as far as I can tell, that's just not true. They all claim to be correct. They all claim to have scriptural support. They all claim to be the one exclusive truth, and they all want converts. They are fundamentally the same in the goals that they want and the things that they believe as it pertains to other people. We are right. We have the only truth. We need more people on our side. That is a fundamental difference. What you mean when you say fundamental is scriptural. And I'm not convinced that scriptural is fundamental, because you still need beliefs before the scripture to get to the scripture. But that's more of a side note. I already went into great detail on that on the last stream last week, which if you didn't see, I highly encourage you to go to watch. As far as this particular issue is concerned, I strongly disagree. At best, they are fundamentally similar and superficially different, because what they claim to be right about doesn't matter. They all claim to be right, and that is the fundamental similarity.
And the fundamental difference that you see in Jesus Christ is in his uniqueness and exclusivity of his claim.
Uniqueness and exclusivity have nothing to do with truth. So,
And the embrace that he gives to all humanity, the perfection of his life.
Perfection, meaning what?
The purity of his life.
What's the difference between purity and perfection? Is it possible for someone to be perfect without being pure? I can understand maybe someone being pure without being perfect, but is it possible for someone to be perfect without pure? And I don't know how you demonstrate these qualities in a human life or in anything at all, ever.
The death and the resurrection. To me, that coherence of his answers convinces me.
I also have very, very high doubts as to the coherence of his answers. If anything, that's probably the biggest problem of why I identify as an atheist, because none of it even seems coherent enough for me to come to a conclusion of yes or no on it. I don't even understand what it means for anything to be perfect or pure, or by what mechanism something could rise from the dead. I have no idea what these things practically mean, so I can't assess their truth value. And in conversations like this, people just straight up don't explain what they mean. They assume you know what a resurrection is, as if it happens all the time. And they don't bother explaining the mechanism. They don't bother explaining how he was pure. They don't bother explaining anything. They just sort of assume that you know. And if you're entering this conversation with as few assumptions as possible, as few biases as possible, or just with almost no knowledge of the subject, none of this is really going to do anything for you if you're using a skeptical approach and just not believing things.
That he is who he claimed to be, and truth, by definition, is exclusive.
It is exclusive of what is false, but it's also coherent and makes sense. And just because he's coherent doesn't mean that he was telling the truth, because a lot of lies can be coherent. I'm not convinced that it makes sense, nor am I convinced that it's true.
All truth claims to be exclusive. Buddhism claims to be exclusive. Hinduism claims to be exclusive. They all have exclusivity built into that.
Almost like it's a fundamental similarity.
But in the person of Christ, you see the demonstration in his birth, life, death, and resurrection. So I say to me,
almost like that's a superficial difference.
I'm convinced that because it coheres and because I have personally verified it in my own life, and you can do that too and find that experience, and that he is who he claimed to be.
I don't know what you mean by that, because you're not giving any resources or citations or any evidence for me to go off of. So I can only assume you're referring to personal anecdotes and experiences. And no, that's not good enough. I don't believe the alien abductee that claims to have been abducted by aliens. So I don't believe the Christian that claims to have seen the risen Christ. And that shouldn't be good enough. And I think that's an odd standard to put out there. That's an odd message to put out there, that in order to verify the truth of something, you have to experience it yourself. Never mind the fact that you will never experience planets light years away from where we are, but they still will be there. Nevertheless, I also don't understand the coherence, because you kind of just said it's coherent, but you didn't demonstrate that it's coherent. You didn't even demonstrate how it answered any of the 4 questions. You just said that it did. And just because someone can answer a question coherently does not mean that they're giving the correct answer.
Thank you.
Just to add something that Robbie's already mentioned, but the resurrection was particularly key for me in my investigation of this. I was studying philosophy. It was very important to me not to have to take some blind leap of faith. And the fact that there was a publicly verifiable historical claim that I could look into was very, very important. And if you ask...
Again, I feel the need to point out that even if this historical claim played out exactly as it was described to have played out, that would not mean that Jesus was a god. At best, that would mean he was a necromancer, or a victim of necromancy, or any other supernatural explanation you can come up with. I fail to understand how you look at a resurrection and then conclude godhood as opposed to any of the myriad of other supernatural explanations. And you can't tell me there aren't other supernatural explanations for resurrections if you've actually studied other religions or hell, even a little bit of fiction.
Scholars 100 years ago, how did we come up with a Christian myth of the resurrection? They would have said, well, one person told the truth to this person, that person told this.
Why would you assume that one person told the truth to another person? Just starting on that assumption has already messed up the investigation. This is what I was complaining about earlier. You can't start with this person told this person the truth. How do you know that? If you could verify that someone was telling the truth, then you wouldn't need to go down that whole chain of reasoning. You could just verify the truth on your own.
This person, that person told this person, and a few generations down the line, we had a crazy myth of the resurrection.
Also, it's worth noting that the telephone game works very similarly this way. The further information has to travel between people, the more likely it is to get jumbled and messed up. And this is a realistic example or experiment that anyone can try anywhere. If you just have a somewhat moderately large group of individuals, you can tell one person and then tell them to tell someone else. And if it goes around in a circle, by the time it gets back to the original, usually the message is substantially different than when it originally started out. And if that is the case, I see no reason why that couldn't have happened here with Christianity.
Since then, in the last couple of decades, scholarship has really turned around on this question, in part because there are a few places in the Bible, in particular a passage at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15. Maybe you can have a look at it later, but it's a very early creed, and it lists all of the people and the groups that Jesus appeared to. He appeared to individuals and to groups at different times,
Allegedly.
in different places, doing many different things.
Allegedly. And
today, even the most atheistic critical scholars date that passage, that early creed, to almost immediately after Jesus' actual death and supposed resurrection.
I call shenanigans. I call extreme shenanigans. The earliest accounts, as far as I'm aware, of Jesus's lifetime are usually not until well after his death, at least decades after his death. So I'm not convinced that this was immediately after his also alleged death. And given that all of this is supposed to be the Bible, I fail to understand how Christians don't recognize the Bible verifying the Bible and how information does not work that way. Books do not verify themselves. They might give you resources so you can verify them, but that's not what this is doing. This isn't giving you the ability to go and check for yourself. This is saying we're right because such and so happened. I fail to see how this isn't the Bible verifying the Bible. This part of the Bible is right because this other part of the Bible says this other thing.
So the legendary development hypothesis has been thrown out of the window.
No, it hasn't. You haven't demonstrated how it's been thrown out of the window. You just say the Bible says so, and then you throw it out the window as if that's good enough.
What people know now is that there actually were a lot of people. The passage says hundreds of people, and then...
Again, the passage says, not the information says, not evidence suggests, it's the passage says. And I really want to know which atheistic scholars or atheistic individuals you know that are willing to just grant this because the Bible says so. And even if they were, even if you could find the most hardcore atheistic person that was willing to grant this, that wouldn't make it true. At the end of the day, the truth is dictated by the evidence, not by the Bible, not by the coherence of the Bible, not how much the Bible supports itself, but by the evidence. And the Bible saying something isn't evidence, it is the claim that needs to be verified. It is the thing that requires evidence, not evidence itself.
And it says, most of whom are still living, almost as if to say, go out and ask them yourself.
That doesn't matter. It's like, that doesn't matter to us now. And even if it says most of whom are still living, that also doesn't matter. I don't see the importance of that from a perspective. So we're trying to investigate the truth of these claims in the Bible, and then one part of the Bible says go out and ask some of the people they're still alive today. That does nothing for us now, and given that the people are not specifically mentioned by name, I don't see how that did anything for people back then. And if they had names that they told people back then but just didn't write down, why did they do that?
There were many people who were utterly convinced they had seen this man Jesus alive and interacting with him after he had died.
Allegedly, if we just believe what the Bible says. But if we were willing to believe what the Bible says, we would be Christians already. Putting that issue aside, even if that is the case, lots of people believe in things and are also wrong. Do you know how many people sincerely and honestly believe in Hinduism? And you think that they are not correct because Jesus is the way, the truth, the life, and all that stuff. So you know, based on the fact that you believe other religions are incorrect, you know that a lot of people believing something doesn't make it true. Yet here you are appealing to a lot of people's belief to demonstrate the truth of something. For shame.
And so that then raises the question, what can account for that? What can account for this huge historical gap between what should have been the movement-ending death of Jesus and then the explosion of Christianity?
He says movement-ending death of Jesus as if famous leaders aren't martyred all the time. Martin Luther King Jr. died, but that didn't end the civil rights movement. That didn't kill it. And why would it? Why would you think killing a significant or even the most important leader would necessarily kill the movement? I don't get this line of reasoning that this should have been the end of the movement.
Worshipping.
Also, as far as what could have led to the explosion of Christianity, that is a nonsensical question as it relates to the truth of the matter. Because again, there are other popular religions that have exploded onto the scene, and you don't seem to quite care what accounts for their explosion, because your explosion is the true one. Another fundamental difference. When our religion explodes in popularity, that's a demonstration of its truth. But when other religions explode in popularity, that doesn't matter.
A man as God, unthinkable. The Sabbath changed from Saturday.
You still haven't changed. Still haven't defined what a God is. But okay.
To Sunday, unthinkable. What bridges the gap which is there no matter what you believe? That's
no matter what you believe is a huge problem, because what if I don't believe the things on the other side of the gap? What if I don't even believe that there is a gap? What if I don't believe in any of this? None of this addresses it. You're trying to present a gap and that there must be an explanation for these things, but I'm not convinced that these things happened in the first place, and you haven't demonstrated that they have. You just have the Bible says so and some scholars say so, which is not good enough because those things don't make something true. Both the Bible and the scholars can very much be wrong. So I see no reason that those things are the hinge on which I should decide that Christianity or the events written in the Bible are true.
It's the question for anyone. Christians bridge that gap with the resurrection. When I was looking into this as a university student,
I also find it interesting that it's not bridged with evidence. It's bridged with specific stories without regard to their truth, or at least that's how it's framed.
Asked the top 2 skeptical New Testament scholars at Princeton to meet up for a coffee to talk about this, because I said, this is what I've just laid out for you. This is what I'm seeing. Here's the big gap. And I thought, okay, Christians fill that gap with the resurrection, but surely those who aren't Christians must have equally plausible alternatives. And I said,
I love how he thinks that resurrection and a man coming back from the dead is a plausible explanation. And that's not a knock at the lack of evidence to the resurrection. That's a knock at the explanatory power of a resurrection. Again, even assuming I was willing to grant that a resurrection did in fact occur, that then does not mean it's a God, because there are things that can resurrect without being a God, or is the only thing that can ever resurrect a God. Because I don't think that's something Christians or other people believe. Not to mention the fact that resurrection itself is a tricky concept into what it even means to come back from the dead, as if being dead is a state that you are in for which you can then be removed. But putting the issue of the conceptual wackiness of resurrection aside, even if I was willing to grant that, resurrection is proof of resurrection and nothing else. Anything else requires its own demonstration. Jesus coming back from the dead doesn't mean anything other than Jesus came back from the dead. And even if you think that that requires an explanation, the explanation that you choose to give has to actually explain it. If the resurrection is an explanation for some other thing, then it actually has to explain it. It has to answer more questions than it raises and actually give someone a better understanding of a particular topic. Otherwise, how does it have any explanatory function if people understand less after coming into contact with it? If you introduce me to a concept, a piece of evidence, or any bit of information, and I end up with less of an understanding than I did before I engaged with that concept, how does that concept serve as a good explanation?
To them, how do you fill that gap? And one of them glanced towards a mass hallucination hypothesis, which isn't taken seriously in the literature. She wasn't glancing towards it with any conviction either. There's simply too much data, too many appearances, too many people. Hallucinations are things that happen to individuals, not to groups.
Okay, so there was a lot there, and a lot of it didn't make any sense whatsoever. So I'm gonna have to go back a little bit and demonstrate how he did not even he didn't even begin to entertain the topic. He just dismissed it offhand for a bunch of very poor reasons.
Said to them, how do you fill that gap? And one of them glanced towards a mass hallucination hypothesis.
I love how they say glance towards and not genuinely presented. It's almost as if you're assuming some sort of disingenuous motive on their part. Not saying that they sincerely told you the idea that they thought was best or presented a possible alternative that they thought was viable. No, they just glanced at it.
Which isn't taken seriously in the literature.
What does it matter whether or not it's taken seriously in the literature? The literature is the thing we're trying to evaluate. If the literature is the result of hallucinations, but it's trying not to say that, of course it's not going to take it seriously. This is like if someone presents you with an alternative explanation for the resurrection. Perhaps Jesus faked his death. Well, that's not taken seriously by the Bible. What difference does it matter if it's taken seriously by the Bible or not?
She wasn't glancing towards it with any conviction either.
Of course, conviction, because conviction has something to do with truth. Either it has something to do with truth, which is stupid because there are genuinely convicted wrong people, or it has nothing to do with truth and you just brought up this random thing you know has nothing to do with truth. Take your pick.
Simply too much data, too many appearances.
Data? What data? I feel like if you had the data, you wouldn't need to be asking this question. You cannot say that there is a gap that needs to be explained and then appeal to data. If the data was a sufficient explanation to dismiss this, why isn't that very same data a sufficient explanation to fill the gap? You can't say the data doesn't fill the gap and doesn't give you an explanation that you need, and then say that that same data that's insufficient also dismisses this other thing. Or at least not as far as I can tell, especially not without saying what that data is.
There's too many people. Hallucinations are things that happen to individuals, not to groups.
That is just demonstrably false. That is just actually demonstrably false. Mass hallucinations are a thing, and they do happen all the time. It's not that uncommon for individuals to hallucinate. Even on a pragmatic sense, people who take drugs have mass hallucinations in those groups. I see no valid reason to just dismiss it out of hand. What's your evidence that hallucinations happen on an individual level and not on a group level? What's your evidence that they cannot happen at a group level or cannot happen on a macro scale? Even if I actually put my skepticism to use and entered this conversation completely neutrally, and you said to me that this dismisses the hallucination hypothesis because hallucinations are an individual thing and don't happen on groups. Okay, substantiate that position. Prove that. Do you have a citation? Do you have an experiment? Do you have a study? Do you have anything to substantiate what you're saying? Or are you just saying things? I see no valid reason to assume that mass hallucinations can't happen and hallucinations exclusively happen on an individual level.
The other one, who was a historian, simply said, I'm not interested in that question as a historian. There was some sort of assumption that because it was a miraculous claim, it was therefore not within the remit of proper history. And
that is not what he said. He simply said he was not interested in it as a historical claim. And he's allowed to be. There are various historians of various time periods, and not all of them know everything about all periods of history. Some have specific areas that they specialize in, and some of those areas just don't include the resurrection of Jesus, and that's okay. Someone saying that they're not interested in the subject is not a win for Christianity. But I get the distinct impression that you're going to turn it into that.
I've never understood why. So for me, the resurrection, the fact that you could have arguments that you could consider for that.
Like what? Because you haven't presented them here, so that's just an assumption you're just throwing out there that we're just supposed to believe. But even if you had arguments you could consider, that wouldn't make it right. There are a lot of things that you have arguments that you can consider, but that doesn't make the thing more likely to be true than false.
That blew my mind. I just assumed that's an ancient claim.
It blew your mind that some people had some explanation of the resurrection story. How? What was the mind-blowing part about that? What exactly blew your mind? If it wasn't how absurd and incoherent the idea of a resurrection sounds, then I don't know what it is.
That we could just never know whether that happened or not. But actually, you can look into it and you can look at the facts and then you can ask the question, what?
How do we look into it? As far as you've told us, we just read the Bible and the Bible has justifications for it and that's it. You haven't given us a way to objectively look into it, objectively find out the truth value. You've just basically said, read the Bible, and historians agree with it, some of them.
What best explains the facts. And the reality is that today in the scholarship, the only explanation which is given any degree of credibility is the fact that Jesus actually rose from the dead.
The only explanation is not the correct explanation. The best idea that you can come up with is not necessarily the most correct idea. And I quite frankly don't care what the best idea that isn't challenged can be. If we encounter a subject for the first time that humans in general don't know anything about because it's a relatively new subject, and only one person has an explanation, they do not become right by default just because they're the only person with an explanation. I don't care about what explanations are given credibility. I care about why. I don't care about which explanations are generally accepted. I care about why. Because the why, the evidence, that is what matters, because that is what makes something true or not. That is what gives us the ability to determine if it's true or not. Because if you take that out, I fail to see how anything can be known at all. So I think that's a woefully inadequate way to do research, to merely say, hey, this group has an alleged explanation. No other group has an explanation that's taken seriously. I'm just gonna, believe that one because everyone else is believing it. And that's how you get to true beliefs. You just believe what everybody else believes. Oh, but they're scholars and they have I don't care if they're scholars or not. Being a scholar doesn't make you more likely to be right. It's your reasons that do, because there are a lot of scholars that believe things for bad reasons. There are individuals who are mythicists in the sense that they do not believe that Jesus, or they are not necessarily convinced that Jesus existed as a historical person at all. I am one of them. One thing you could do is engage with Christians and their explanation for the alleged resurrection, but you could also engage with a mythicist and see why they aren't convinced. See what reasons lead them to believe or lead them to not necessarily believe in the historicity of Jesus as a person. But instead of actually looking at both sides, what you did was you read the Bible, you accepted the Christian explanation, and then when people tried to present alternative explanations, you just hand waved it and said, I don't really buy it. There's no real evidence for that. My side has real evidence. What's the real evidence? This book says so. And if you had other real evidence, you would have shown that. But The amount of historians, the amount of consensus, and the amount of credibility given to an idea do not determine its truth. The evidence of the idea, the supporting evidence is what determines it. Not the Bible, not the historians, but the evidence. And instead of presenting that, you presented historians and Bible quotes. Good for you.
Every other explanation has been completely undermined.
Okay, are you going to give all those other explanations and how they're undermined? Are you even going to mention them so that we can go look them up? Or are you just going to say that and we're just supposed to believe you?
So I think it is a rational decision to say that actually happened, and then to take that next personal step of praying a prayer like the one that I prayed.
Just because someone died and came back from the dead doesn't mean that prayer works. It doesn't mean that someone's a god. It doesn't mean anything other than that person died and came back to life. This is very basic, simple stuff, and I don't know how it's so difficult for you to grasp. Death and resurrection don't mean pray to your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, for he is the Lord thy God.
Which was God, the Christian God. I don't know if I'm talking to anyone, but if I am, I'd really...
If you don't know if you're talking to anyone, how are you talking to them? So that was an interesting thing. And if you couldn't glean from that, very simply, very basically, I would consider myself a mythicist in the sense that I am not convinced that Jesus actually existed as a person. As far as I can tell, there's no convincing evidence other than the Bible. And as far as I am aware, most documents of Jesus's life, including the biblical ones, come decades after his alleged life and death. And I see no reason to believe his prophets because they have a very obvious bias in ensuring that the story is true. So, and as far as extra biblical sources go, those date way later, sometimes even up to 100 years after the alleged death of Jesus. And even then, those extra biblical sources almost exclusively talk about Christians and what it is that Christians believe, not the actual resurrection itself and that it happened. And again, I'm going to say this, do not believe me and do not believe the things that I say. If I can get around to it, I will bring out some citations. I did not expect to have to bring them out, but I will try to post them in chat at some point, hopefully before I actually publish this. But go out, do your own research, look into the historicity of Jesus. Don't just believe something because the Bible says it happened. Try to find an extra biblical source. Try to find an extra biblical source that's dated close to the event. Try to find multiple extra biblical sources and try to find any sort of archaeological evidence. Try to actually look into the subject from as neutral a position as you can without merely believing the things that you see, including the alleged evidence that is presented to you. If someone says, well, we know this happened because there's an empty tomb, ask about the empty tomb, ask where it is, if it's still available, if we can find it, how we know, things like that. Continue to ask questions and don't just believe anyone, especially me. Now, with that being said, we've got about another hour, and now I want to switch to more social subjects. So now we're going to talk about Steven Universe and racism and how one can, end racism by just not being racist. And why wouldn't someone be racist? Well, we're going to find out why.
Hey, when we're older, let's get married. You can't get married. Why not? Black people can't marry white people. Hey.
Now, up to this point, let's acknowledge the facts. This is a commercial on Cartoon Network primarily aimed at kids. And thus far, we have had two children of different races, but both male, want to get married at a young age, and then a random child who is presumably listening in on their conversation just decide to break up their handshake and tell them that they couldn't get married because black people can't marry white people, even though that's factually inaccurate. And even this child would know that that's factually inaccurate. So I don't see what we've gotten so far, but let's keep going. Hopefully we'll get something out of this.
Hey now.
It's Garnet from Steven Universe!
You know, Garnet from Steven Universe, the character known to just be around playgrounds.
Kids, don't be racist.
Well, that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Garnet said don't be racist. That's the end of the discussion. Pack it up, boys. Racism's over. Garnet said don't be racist. That just ends it. I'm being overly dramatic to demonstrate the point that if one was not racist, then this commercial does nothing for them. And if someone was racist, they are extremely unlikely to change that opinion merely because Garnet from Steven Universe said so. Regardless of whether they're an adult or a child, simply saying someone shouldn't be racist is not going to be an effective means of dissuading them from being a racist, as if racists are never told to not be racist.
Cut. Okay, people, we just need to get coverage. We'll start again in 5.
And of course, this was a commercial, and I knew that this was a commercial going in, or a commercial within a commercial. But this is where things actually get interesting as far as skepticism goes.
This is the cheesiest job I've ever done. Stuff like this doesn't actually happen in real life. Whoa there. Are you kidding? It totally does.
Are you kidding? Someone believes something different than what I believe? You gotta get out of here. You're having a laugh, bro.
Just because this has never happened to you doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
At no point did he say this never happened because it doesn't happen to him. He just said it doesn't happen. And from all context, I see no reason why that's not true. Unless I am wrong and I just haven't been around playgrounds in a very long time, which this is COVID time, so I don't know, a lot could change. It is not typically the case that children who are of the same gender but different races are told that they ought not to get married because they're different races, completely ignoring the fact that they're the same gender. The hyper-specific scenario that you displayed does not typically happen. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. If anyone has any evidence, I can't find anything of this being a common thing within children's experience, so I see no valid reason to assume this is the case. But let's say for the sake of argument that it is. Let's say I'm completely wrong and this happens all the time, not just in the children's context in the playground and stuff, but that people all the time are telling other people that they can't get married because they're the same race. Two things. Number one, that is factually false. People of different races can and do get married all the time. And number two, so what? Why should anyone care what these random racist people have to say? Why are we giving them any more attention or any mind space at all? If someone comes up to you and says something that you know is false and is demonstrably stupid, why are you wasting your time telling them don't be stupid, as if that's going to stop them from being stupid? Like I said, Garnet said, therefore, I'm going to stop being a racist. As far as people who are already not racist, this does nothing for them because they're already not racist. And if one doesn't believe that this scenario happens, merely saying that it does and merely saying that just because it doesn't happen to you doesn't mean that it doesn't happen does not demonstrate your case. Just because it doesn't happen to me does not mean that it doesn't happen at all. That is correct to say. And just because you do say it happens because it happens to you does not mean that it actually does happen. Neither one of us saying something based on our experiences makes us right, because our experiences can be directly contradictory and only one of us can be right. At the end of the day, it is the evidence that demonstrates whether or not something happens, not my experiences or lack thereof, and not your experiences or lack thereof. Everyone has to demonstrate their case and not merely say that it happens, even if you're Garnet from Steven Universe. So not only does this just not make sense in the context that it's being presented, it also is woefully ineffective at whomever this is supposed to target. Because again, if this is supposed to target racist kids, I strongly doubt they're going to just stop being racist now. Because Garnet from Steven Universe said don't be racist.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. Seriously, I didn't know.
Also, did anyone notice the turnaround? This kid went from that never really happens, and then someone said, yes, it does. And then he's like, okay, I believe you. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. No skepticism at all. No invasion, no ask for evidence, no ask for an explanation at all. Just some people said, no, you're wrong. And he said, okay, I believe you. I'm so sorry. As if one needs to be sorry being wrong, when being wrong is just a thing that happens. People don't choose to be wrong. They go with the best information that's available to them. Sometimes they end up getting it right. Sometimes they end up getting it wrong. But at the end of the day, that's not something to apologize for because it wasn't an active choice on your behalf. As if you could have just gone with better information than the information you thought was the best.
Yeah, everyone messes up sometimes.
Yeah, because being wrong is the same thing as messing up.
But you gotta realize it hurts to deal with racism.
Why? Racism isn't practically applicable in the same ways as it once was. So unless you're referring about people doing things to you, which is illegal and very socially stigmatized, what is hurting you about racism? Is it people believing bad things, or rather people believing things that you don't like? Well, sorry, believing things doesn't automatically hurt you. I don't see why you'd even care what other people believe as long as they don't do anything to you. Is it that they vocalize their beliefs? Is it not just that racists are racist, but that they admit that they're racist or that they say they're racist? Well, again, they can say whatever they want, and most of the time, if not exclusively, it's extremely socially stigmatized, especially in America, where this is primarily broadcast. So I see no way that this is actually hurtful. The only way I can see this being hurtful is that it hurts your feelings. And I see no reason to prioritize your feelings at all, because your feelings are not practically influential, or rather, they don't actually hurt. If something hurts your feelings, you can still have a house, you can still have a roof over your head, you can still eat food, you can still live a very productive and happy life. I think the question we should be asking is, why do you care, rather than don't be racist? Because at the end of the day, this is not an effective means to prevent racist people from being racist. And I'm not convinced that you can ever get to a state where no one ever is going to be racist at all. But even if you could, at the end of the day, all I see that changing is that now you don't have hurt feelings. And I don't think that we should be teaching children to prioritize their feelings to such a high degree that you're not allowed to say things that hurt my feelings. You disagree with me on a particular topic, whether or not racism happens as is displayed. Therefore, you hurt my feelings. It hurts my feelings when people don't agree with me. That's essentially what that boils down to, is when people don't agree with me on this particular subject, it hurts my feelings. And that matters because reasons. All due respect, well, no, not really. I don't care about your feelings, and I see no reason why I should care about your feelings. I care about what actually happens to you rather than how you feel about what happens to you.
People act like it's not real, and
is it that they're acting like it's not real, or is it that they genuinely don't believe that it's real?
It makes it feel even worse.
So I was right. It is just your feelings. It makes it feel worse. Well, I'm not sorry. I don't care how it makes you feel. I care what it actually does to you. At the end of the day, if it hurts your feelings, but it doesn't actually hurt you, why should I care?
You have to acknowledge racism to work against it.
It is not my responsibility to acknowledge racism. It is your responsibility to demonstrate it. I cannot acknowledge something that has not been sufficiently demonstrated. And merely saying that it exists is not a demonstration, that's a claim. Again, this is teaching people that if they are corrected on a racial issue, they should just go with it. They should just believe it. They shouldn't investigate. They shouldn't question it, because questioning and investigating and disagreeing hurts people's feelings, and we don't want to do that. So let's just believe whatever people tell us and admit whatever people tell us to admit, because that's how you defeat racism. Just universal agreement.
You're right. I can do that.
Whether or not you can do that is different than whether or not, you actually should.
You kids better work on this before the wedding.
Whoa, that's just for the script. We only just met today.
Be anti-racist. What's the functional difference between an anti-racist and someone who's just not racist? Because they sound like the same thing. I don't understand the message here, and I don't understand who it was intended for. It couldn't be intended for children who aren't racist, because this is going to do nothing for them because they're already not racist. And this couldn't have been intended for children who are racist, because merely telling them not to be racist is not going to change their mind, and telling them that not believing certain scenarios happen hurts their feelings is also not going to stop them from being racist. So I don't get it. I really don't understand the point of this message and what it was supposed to accomplish. But we're not done. We have one more Steven Universe social video to go through, and I think it's almost as interesting. I just need a second to do this because I am not fancy, so I have to do this the layman way. And now we get to hear Pearl's side of the story, which oh boy, do I have a lot to say about this, but let's get into it.
All right, class. Can anyone tell me who invented the light bulb? Thomas Edison! That's not entirely true. The light bulb could more rightfully be attributed to Lewis Latimer, the black inventor behind the filament inside the bulb.
Okay, so for the sake of this, I'm going to address this as if I have no knowledge of the light bulb, and I'm going to address this as if all of this information is completely new to me. So, assuming what you said is true, which would defeat the point of skepticism and is a bad habit to have, but assuming what you said was true, the person who developed the filament inside the light bulb should not be credited for the invention of the light bulb, in the same way that the person who developed the wheel should not be given credit for the invention of the car. Just because someone developed an important part of something does not mean that they then should get credit for whatever that thing then contributes to. So that doesn't make sense to credit him as the inventor of the light bulb merely because he invented the filament of the light bulb, and it doesn't make any more sense than saying someone who invented the wheel should be credited as the same person who invented the car, even though they just invented the wheel, which is a part of the car.
His invention made light bulbs affordable and efficient enough for the general public, bringing electric light into households around the world.
Okay, I believe you.
Well, so now you know.
Do I? Because I don't think I do. I think I just listened to you say something and believed it without any skepticism whatsoever. And I would hardly count that as knowledge, but hey, I guess that's what you mean by knowledge.
Wait, is that it? Hold on. We're not going to mention why he invented the filament?
It's not relevant why he invented the filament. This is a history class. We go over the facts that happened, not the motivations. Why would that be relevant?
To create a better standard of living for people who had only just been freed from slavery?
Citation needed.
Are we going to ask why kids are apparently learning about Thomas Edison? Thomas Edison!
Okay, because it's bad for children to learn about Thomas Edison?
Ugh, and not learning about Lewis Latimer?
Who says they're not learning about Lewis Latimer? At the end of the day, you picked, or rather, to be more accurate, since this is a cartoon, you made up a random class. Now, I'm willing to grant that most people probably don't know who Lewis Latimer is, and most children probably aren't taught that, but I don't know. Schools change and evolve all the time, especially in COVID times. It's hard to say with absolute certainty what kids are and are not taught, especially with the invention of Black History Month. If you asked this question around February, you might have gotten a very different answer than you got now. But I'll let this go on.
These textbooks are incomplete. There were Black Roman warriors, Black medieval knights, Black classical musicians, Black cowboys, Black fighter pilots. Where are they?
Where are the Black fighter pilots in a class about who invented the light bulb? excuse me? When you say history books are incomplete, what you mean is they are not in their totality. When history books are made for children, they don't go over every single aspect of history and every single potential piece of information. Now, if this was a college level class or perhaps even a high school level class, I might be willing to grant this point that there are incomplete textbooks which need to be improved. But this is a children's class. Do you really expect them to go into great length and detail about the history of the light bulb and the filament within for children? Is that an essential piece of information that they actually need to know in their day-to-day lives? Because I don't think that it is. This complaint seems frivolous in the sense that it doesn't seem to have any pragmatic value or benefit. It seems to just be complaining that this history book doesn't recall every single event that ever happened around the world at the same time ever. And if there's any bit of information that's missing, especially if that information pertains to a person of color, then it's incomplete.
I worry about you humans because you only live, what, about 100 years? You rely on these stories to know your own history.
Some of us do, but some of us receive different stories, unless you think everyone gets the same education, which is not necessarily true. And considering that you aren't referring to America necessarily, you're referring to humans, as you put it, there are lots of different people telling a lot of different stories around the world, not just the one textbook you happen to pick up.
Thanks to systemic racism.
So I guess this is the time where I lose the very few subscribers that I have and talk about systemic racism. I treat systemic racism in the same way that I treat the subjects pertaining to religion. As far as I can tell, it is an incredibly ill-defined term with no coherent definition that makes sense to me, so I don't believe in it. And I extend that sentiment here. If I am someone who has never heard this term, and I am watching this commercial for the first time, and you mention systemic racism, I can see there only being two outcomes. Either I just believe it's a thing because you said so, or I don't, and I perhaps go do my own research. I see no reason to do the former and every reason to do the latter. Just because you say systemic racism exists and or is the explanation for incomplete textbooks does not mean that's the truth. Now you might say, well, this is a children's commercial. It's aimed at children. Of course, they're not going to give lengthy links and citations and all that stuff. To which my response is, this is a children's class in which this is a children's commercial in which the primary person is complaining that children don't know about who invented the filament inside a light bulb. You can't say that this is aimed at children, so it's not made to be complex enough to actually substantiate the things that it says or explain them in a way that makes sense, while also having the primary character complain about something as complex about the filament inside of a light bulb as if that's something children care about.
Storytellers prioritize white accomplishments, which leaves you with an incomplete picture.
Prioritize white accomplishments. Okay, so quick question. If I go to Japan and I look at a Japanese textbook, is it fair for me to complain about the Japanese textbook not including all of its foreigners' accomplishments in Japanese history? Is it fair for me to complain that it's being told by primarily Japanese people to a primarily Japanese audience? Population? Is it fair for me to go to a place that is predominantly African and complain that it is talking about the predominantly African contributions while ignoring the white contributions? And yes, there are white people in Africa. So I see no valid reason why countries, as this seems to be sort of focused on, are under any obligation to tell the complete and utter totality and history of everything to such a great detail, especially if it involves the minority members. And that is not to say the minorities members should be, the accomplishments of minority members of a country should be ignored. That is to say that if you have a majority Asian country, then you would expect to see a majority Asian contribution in the history books. I fail to see why that would be any different in American history books.
Ask yourself as you're learning history, who's telling the story?
If I have to ask that question of my history book, I also have to ask that question of you. Keep that in mind.
Was this modified to make white readers comfortable?
Yes, although that seems very unlikely. Although I don't see any good reason to assume that that's the case, I would take into consideration that the person telling me history may have a bias, such as they're telling a story that makes white readers more comfortable. However, I ask the exact same question of you. The skepticism that you want me to apply to this history book is not the same skepticism that you are encouraging me to apply to you. You want me to listen and believe to the things that you're saying, or else you would bother to substantiate the things you're saying. Yet for some reason, you want me to be skeptical of the history books and be skeptical of the information within. At the end of the day, I have every reason to be just as skeptical of you as I do history books. And I fail to see why this is relevant to children who couldn't care less about the totality of history.
Are major details being left out that would credit people of color and center their point of view?
People of color do not have a point of view. White people do not have a point of view. You are referring to individuals, grouping them together and saying that they have a point of view. Now, you could have meant their points of view, but that's not what you said. But even if that is what you meant, then you need to acknowledge that and expand upon that a little bit more. Acknowledge individuals as individuals and not people of color. By lumping them into a box and saying that their point of view is just ignored, you're acting like they are all the same and they all have the same point of view being ignored. People of color, like all people, have different points of view depending on who they are. And how do you determine whose point of view is being left out? Oh, wait, you seem to be doing that based purely on race, right? Or is there some other way that you're determining? Because that seems to be how you arrived at that conclusion. History books aren't showing enough people of color accomplishments, therefore their point of view is being ignored. But I don't think that's good enough. I don't think you can just look at a race and say, well, I don't see enough of this race, therefore the ideas that this race has and their perspective is necessarily being ignored, because that's not the same thing.
Honestly, I should have asked for script approval before agreeing to do this.
I probably should have done that before agreeing to do this in my stream, but hey, look, we all make mistakes, as was mentioned in the previous video.
Some rewrites. I'm sorry, we didn't know.
Well, so...
Again, this is a prime example of the skepticism issue which made me want to address these videos. Someone else just listened and believed to what they were told, and instead of engaging in skepticism, instead of voicing a different perspective, instead of not believing what was said, they just went with it. They just did it. She said it. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I believe you. You're right. I'm sorry. We didn't know. And again, as if lack of knowledge is something to apologize for when it's something completely outside of your control. I don't understand why one would apologize for something they don't know. And I also don't understand why you would send a message to children that they should just believe whoever tells them things. Unless it has something to do with systemic racism, in which case they should believe whatever anyone tells them about systemic racism, as long as they say it exists. I think it's very odd and strange that the characters that are not the main characters in this show just go along with whatever the main characters say. There's no skepticism, there's no disagreement, we're just going to go along with it. Pearl presented one point of view and one potential perspective as to history books being incomplete and why. But instead of including alternative perspectives and letting people decide for themselves, you're only going to show them the side you want them to see and ignore all the other sides, ignore all the other perspective, ignore all the other interpretations. Or do you genuinely think that there are no other interpretations to history books and their lack of completion?
Oh, now you know. I swear.
I don't think that I do. Again, just because you tell me something doesn't mean that I now know something. I know that you told me something, but you haven't demonstrated anything. You haven't proven your point. And again, I get it. You're reading too much into this. This is a children's commercial. But a children's commercial aimed at complaining about the filaments of light bulbs does not get the leniency of not being criticized. I stress this point because I genuinely believe it. Go away. No one and nothing is immune from criticism. Everyone and everything is subject to it. And I will not ignore something on the grounds that it is made for children if it is bad, or if it is inaccurate, or if it is teaching credulity over skepticism, if it is shaming skepticism or disagreement because it hurts people's feelings. These are things that need to be addressed. No one and nothing is immune from criticism, including me. I don't want anyone to look at this stream and just believe any of the things that I said. Think for yourself. Do your own research. Look into the subjects on your own and come to your own conclusions. And look at all perspectives, not just the ones that people tell you to believe. Look at all the perspectives for or against, and then come to your own conclusion. I personally can't make sense of the perspectives, which is why I think I'm a good candidate to talk about skepticism, to demonstrate why these things don't make sense to me. But alas, I would have to say that that is the summary of what I have for you guys this week. I know this one is a much shorter video, a much shorter stream than we're used to doing, but there wasn't too much that really got me riled up and I really wanted to talk about, except one more thing that I just remembered. And since this is a stream and no one's here anyway, I can just do whatever I want. So I'm gonna. Give me one moment.
Then I've got.
Sorry for anyone listening to this afterwards. You might want to skip ahead a little bit because I'm doing a thing. Okay, there we go. And now it's time to talk about equality and equal rights, equal fights. So before we get into it, equal rights, equal fights, as far as I understand it, is a movement consisting of the concept basically of equal fighting. If you hit someone, you ought to expect that they hit you back, regardless of gender. That seems to be the core message of what it is, as well as the additional, if you hit someone regardless of gender, you ought to expect to be held accountable and responsible to the fullest extent of the law. But I think this primarily refers to, and at least most of the examples that I've seen, it refers to if you hit someone, you should expect to be hit back, even if you're a woman. So let's talk about that in this context and see what Roma Army has to say about it. I forgot the beginning of this video was kind of like my streams, just sort of dead and silent. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit.
Because this is something that has come up a lot on my social media, especially today. There's been quite some controversy around it. And so I just kind of want to give like women's perspective a little bit as.
All right, we've already have a problem. No one, male or female, man or woman, or whatever you identify as, can give women's perspective. You can give a woman's perspective. You can give your perspective and the perspective of people who agree with you, but you cannot speak for anyone else. You speak for yourself first and foremost. And going forward, I am going to assume that everything you say that is from women's perspective is from your perspective. You can't project yourself onto women and just say, well, I think I'll speak for the women. Because clearly those women can't speak for themselves.
How it makes us feel, but I also just like want to acknowledge that I understand where it comes from.
This is a big contradiction that's going to come into play, where you understand good and well the actual message that's being put across, yet your main complaint is with a message that is not being put across. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. Let's get into it.
So with that, if I'm good to continue, just comment no dick. And cheers. Okay, well, I'm just going to start off with it. So the topic equal rights, equal fights. So, I understand that when guys are saying equal rights, equal fights, they're
because only guys say this, and women definitely don't say that, right?
saying, they just don't want a woman to be able to beat the shit out of them, bully them, and then when they go to defend themselves, they be labeled as like an asshole.
It is not merely that they don't want to be labeled something. It's that they want to be allowed to do that. There can be severe repercussions for a man who decides to defend himself against a woman assaulting him. That is what they don't want to be the case. They want it to actually be equal, in that if the woman defended herself from the man, she would most likely not be seen as the aggressor. Whereas the man feels that if he defends himself from a woman who is assaulting him, he is seen as the aggressor. So he would rather the situation be seen equally rather than merely having one gender seen as the aggressor regardless of who actually is the aggressor. At least that is the perspective. I am not saying that's a perspective I agree with. I am explaining that's the perspective as far as I understand it.
Or a monster. And I 100% agree with that. Now, where it rubs women the wrong way is because, like, if you just break down the phrase equal rights, equal fights.
You understand that equal rights means equality under rights, but you seem to think that the phrasing indicates something that the message does not, which shouldn't be relevant because you understand what the message is. The fact that you understand with and agree with the main message that is being put across negates any contention or disagreement that you might have, because you said you 100% agreed with it. I don't understand how you can understand what someone's saying and then also complain about what they're not saying, because what you're about to go into is not what they're saying, and you know that because you just said you know that's not what they're saying. You know they're saying this other thing that you agree with.
And women are kind of sitting over here like, well, when we think of equal rights, we think of like,
Why do I care what you think of equal rights? If I am fighting for equal rights, I am fighting for my idea of equal rights and what I think is best. You do the same, unless you decide what to fight for based on what other people think are equal rights. I see no valid reason to care about what you think is equal rights when determining what I think is equal rights and what to fight for. Because you could very much be wrong, which doesn't seem to be an idea that has crossed your mind.
Having an equal amount of women in politics.
Having an equal amount of women in politics is not equal rights, because women are under no obligation to have any particular political leaning, just like men, and adding more women into politics isn't going to add to any more particular of a political leaning. Even if it did, that would kind of be inequality, because then you just want women in so they can support the ideas that you agree with. And if you don't want women in for that reason, you just want women in there because women, that's also not a good reason. In politics, like in everything, you should have the most qualified individuals for the role be in that position. But instead of qualifications, your primary consideration is genitals or gender identity, to be more specific. I see no valid reason why we should have an equal amount of men, women, non binary, gender queer, and every kind of identifying person in politics. I see no valid reason why that's the case, and I fail to understand how that helps anybody. I would much rather have 100 straight white cis males in politics who support policies that I agree with than I would have equal representation politics, but all of those politicians think that we should kill the homeless people or something. I would much rather have diversity of ideas or ideas I agree with rather than skin colors. Because if you have 50% of men and 50% of women and 100% Republican, I don't think that that is good for any system. And even if that's impractical, your primary concern should be the politics and not the gender.
Having the same job opportunities.
Do they not?
Being able to afford to be a single mother without having to rely on the government or child support.
If you make the decision to be a single mother and then expect not to rely on the government or child support, then you are expecting to rely on work unless you think you should get paid for having a child. And I see no valid reason why that's the case. I see no valid reason why anyone else should have to pay for your decision to become a mother if that was in fact your decision, which is one of the reasons I did the whole abortion video last week and stressed the importance of it. If you made the decision not to get an abortion, presumably assuming you have the option, and you decide to become a parent, why is that a decision that anyone else should pay for? Why should anyone else pay for your decision to be a mother? You want to be a mother, but you don't think that you should have to work. And you also don't think the government should help you. And you also don't think that you should have to rely on child support. You think that you should either just get things for free or everybody should just pay for things for you. Or you should just get a job, which is what you can do now. So then I don't see the complaint.
Like that's kind of how we see it. So whereas guys, when you guys think of equal rights, men.
When men think of equal rights, they definitely don't think about the same things as women because they're men. So they don't have any similarities to women. They can't have the same thoughts and positions on things. They're men. The way this is phrased is implying a distinction and a difference between men and women that I don't see any reason to believe it actually exists. You phrase this as if this is the woman's side and this is the man's side, as if these sides don't cross over and there aren't men on one side and women on the opposite side. You act like men and women can't or don't have the same views of equal rights. And I see no reason to imply that that's the case, that being a man means you have these views of equal rights, and being a woman means you have these views of equal rights. And that kind of box thinking is exactly the opposite of what an equal rights activist should be promoting.
Have been fighting for the right to not have violence evoked against their bodies for the longest time. We know this as, just because you're a man, it means that you can get called to war at any moment. You literally have to.
Okay, I believe you.
Pardon me, put yourself in the line of fire, risk your life just because you have a penis.
Okay, I believe you. I mean, you haven't backed that up. And regardless of whether or not I actually agree with that, or whether or not I actually know that to be true, again, unless you're making this for someone who already is on your side, you're going to need to actually explain, elaborate a little bit more, explain how I can find this out, maybe provide some citations so that I can actually go find this information instead of just saying it, It's important for people who are new that you elaborate on these points instead of just quickly mention them and throw them away as if they're supposed to just believe you.
when guys think of equal rights, because understand, like, men and women, we have different opportunities.
Like what? You can say we have different opportunities, but saying it doesn't make it true. Evidence does. And if you're not going to bother to present evidence, why did you bother to say it in the first place? Unless you expected people to just believe you without any evidence or citations or anything. And if you would say, oh, well, it's not my job to educate you, shit lord, you have to do your own research, then basically you want to be able to say stuff for free and not get criticized. And then when people criticize you, it's not your responsibility to back up the things you say, it's their responsibility to back up the things you say. And if that's not backwards, I don't know what is.
We have different forms of oppression as well.
I'm not willing to grant that anyone has any form of oppression, and you saying so most certainly doesn't change my mind.
And so, when guys think of equal rights, like I said, they think of, equal rights in family courts. They think about equal rights where, sexual violence against young men are taken seriously, just like they are women.
Is that not the case? Again, this isn't about whether or not I personally agree with these things. This is about coming from a skeptical perspective. You're throwing a lot at somebody who might be new and probably isn't going to believe all this. And perhaps this isn't for new people. Perhaps this is for your audience who already knows these things and already agrees with these things, which is fine. But if you want to bring about substantial change, you're going to have to continuously try to reach new people. And if the content you make ever stops being for new people and starts to just be for the audience who already agrees with you, then what are you doing? What change are you actually producing? Are you actually growing and actually teaching and actually learning and progressing? Or are you just talking to a bunch of your friends about something? What's the key difference?
And they think of, domestic violence cases where, they're not taken seriously. They're told to man up. Police officers will say things to them like, well, you're lucky you didn't hurt her in the process, or it would be you going to jail. Those are some really serious things that, guys experience all over the world daily.
Citation needed.
So, when guys think of equal rights, of course, their mind is going to go to, the right to not have violence evoked on them. And I understand that. But you have to understand that,
before you get to that point, it's important to note that I don't have to understand anything. Individuals sometimes say this, and I don't see any reason why it's valid. I don't have to understand it. Not just from a stubborn point of view of just, I don't have to understand it because America writes, I don't have to understand anything. But from an intellectual point of view, just because you said something or just because you voice a perspective about how someone else feels, that's not something that I have to take into consideration. If I'm trying to evaluate the truth, someone else's perspective might not always be important to me, and I might not have to understand. For example, if I were fighting for equal rights back when women did not have equal rights, why do I have to understand, for example, how men might feel about it or how they might perceive it? Why is that something that I have to understand as opposed to fighting for the rights that I believe in? I suppose I might have to understand in terms of communication, but if those men like you demonstrate an understanding of the point that I'm making, then I definitely don't see why I have to understand anything if I know they understand me.
Equal rights, equal fights, it doesn't sound very nice. And
there are a lot of messages that don't sound very nice to different people. I'm fairly certain that slave owners thought the idea of abolition didn't sound very nice, but whether it sounds nice has nothing to do with whether or not it is what we should be doing.
The equal rights doesn't and shouldn't equal fighting.
Yeah, it should if the fighting occurs. Equal rights should equal fights. If someone is fighting you, you should be able to fight them back. If someone of any gender is being assaulted by someone else of any gender, they should be allowed to defend themselves without any presumptions of aggression being made on anyone else's behalf and without any charges being brought against them for defending themselves.
It should mean that no matter if you're a woman, if you're a man, if you're transgender, no matter what you are, if you hit somebody, if you assault somebody, you will be brought to the court of law just the same as anybody else in your gender.
Not just that. That is very important and that is crucial, but also the expectation, what's attached to that message is the expectation that if you hit a man or if you hit a woman or if you hit anyone, that not only would or and should you be brought to justice, but you should also expect that the person you are fighting will defend themselves. It's not merely about the legal defense. It's about teaching people, in this case that you're referencing women, that it is bad for you to expect to be able to hit a man without expecting that same treatment in return. It is bad not only from the perspective of women just being able to abuse men because they don't expect men to do anything back, but it is also bad from the perspective of the safety of women because women, not necessarily malicious ones, may hit a man out of frustration without thinking about it, but may do so because they are under the impression that a man will not hit them back. And then when that man turns out to be an abusive asshole, they are now in a far more dangerous situation. And in both of those cases, it is the abuser and the aggressor who is at fault. But at the end of the day, we should not put people in dangerous situations by discounting the idea that if you hit someone, you should be ready for them to hit you back, or you should expect them to hit you back.
So, like, that's, I think that that's pretty reasonable. I
think that's pretty reasonable, but I would go a step further and again suggest that if you put your hands on someone, it is bad for your health to believe that they will not hit you back. This is more, in my opinion, this is more of a social message than it is a legal message. And not to say that the legal message isn't important, it is, but it's to reinforce from the social perspective that it's not merely about if you hit me, I'm going to call the cops. It's also about if you hit me, I'm going to hit you back. And this is a sentiment that I do not merely extend to men, or this is a sentiment that is not merely extended to men. It is a matter of anyone hitting anyone. So if a man hits a woman, he should expect a frying pan upside his head. And I see no reason why that is a bad thing and why that shouldn't be the case. Men should not be under the belief that they can hit women and women will not retaliate and defend themselves. That is not a belief that men should have, nor is that a belief that women should have, vice versa.
Okay, tonight, Chloe, thank you. I think that that's something that we can all agree on and that we all want to strive for is, the ability to have our issues taken seriously.
Whether or not that's a goal that we all strive towards is not relevant, because at the end of the day, what matters isn't necessarily the goals you strive towards. What matters are whether or not those goals are worth striving towards. Because you're right, everyone believes they're right and everyone thinks that their goal is worth supporting. But at the end of the day, you cannot support every single goal. You have to decide which goals are worth supporting and which goals aren't, to any variety or extent. So it's not enough that we might all agree on this and we might all think that it's important. We actually have to make a case as to why it ought to be important to others who do not agree with us.
And, I understand that men don't mean, equal rights, I can just beat the shit out of women. But
you understand this, and yet for some reason, this video is still going on.
Tonight I had a comment on my Instagram, which you can...
Oh, dear God, you had a comment on your Instagram. Well, bully for you. I understand the point of a movement and a message, but I got a comment on my Instagram. And good Lord knows I can't just ignore that.
Go see for yourself, where this guy said, some of these bitches need to learn that equal... I can't remember exactly what the comment was, but it was something along the lines of, they need to learn that, equal rights means, if you hit me, I'm going to beat the shit out of you, essentially. And that's not what it means, you know what I mean?
I can't speak for that particular commenter, and I cannot defend what you allegedly said he said. However, a different interpretation that I can take of that is that there are some people of both genders who are bad and violent and aggressive for seemingly no good reason. Those individuals need to learn that they cannot assault people without the expectation that these people will fight back. And they should not have any sort of mental security that if they assault people, they will most likely be seen as the victim in the scenario should that person defend themselves. Like I said, this is about social expectations and teaching people that they cannot merely do whatever they want to someone else without expecting that person to defend themselves. It's kind of like the verbal consequence that a lot of second wave feminists advocate for, that you should not have the right to call a woman a bitch and not expect that she call you an asshole. You should expect when you call a woman a bitch that she has free reign to say whatever she wants in reply, and it is justified given what you have done to her. That is the same rule that we are trying to apply here with physicality. If you hit someone, you should expect that they are going to hit you back, both from the perspective of your safety and theirs. That is a good thing to teach, because if you know that someone is going to hit you back if you hit them, that is a stronger deterrent, or that is a strong deterrent against you hitting them, unless you want to get hit, which most people don't. So because you don't want to get hit, and you know that if you hit this person, they will most likely hit you back, that might be a strong enough deterrent. Whereas if you are under the impression that they're not going to hit you because gender, you might feel you have free reign to assault them and suffer no immediate physical consequences. And that is bad. On the flip side, it's bad for you and your personal safety, because you might have that idea that they won't hit you because of gender, and you could be very, very wrong. You could be putting yourself at risk, putting yourself in danger by hitting someone. And at the end of the day, I fail to see how this message negatively impacts women who don't hit men. If you don't hit men, this message is not bad. It doesn't affect you. It has nothing to do with you. This is only a concern if you have any plans or intentions to hit men and you are now worried that they're going to defend themselves. Essentially, the message, as far as I interpret it, is men will defend themselves if you attack them. And I fail to see how that message is problematic. Now, you might say, well, I don't like the label equal rights, equal fights. But I think that that is a semantic, frivolous concern, because that's not a fair dismissal of feminism. It's not fair for me to dismiss feminism knowing what it is, saying that, well, it's feminism, not equalism, which means it prioritizes women or females, and I don't like it, so change the name. Because at the end of the day, that's what this really feels like. It feels like you're attacking the label, not the message, and the attack isn't even really that grounded. It's just, I don't like it, change it.
If you're in a relationship and your partner hits you, the first thing that you should try to do is get out of that space.
Why? If I'm in a relationship and my partner hits me, why should my first priority be to run away as opposed to defend myself? I am not willing to accept the idea that if my partner hit me, and not in the fun way, that they would not hit me again. And I would immediately prepare to defend myself before run away, because if they hit me, they're probably not going to let me run away. I understand this is contextual. I understand this can happen by accident or out of frustration or different things like that. But I think in the cases where it's most relevant, abusive cases, the person doing the hitting is not merely going to let you run away and not merely going to let you escape. You're going to have to defend yourself. And to tell people that they shouldn't be doing that is not a good thing.
First response should not be, oh, she hit me, so I'm going to deck her.
She decked me in the face, but I'm not allowed to deck her in the face. I have to run away. How does that sound equal to you?
she slapped me, so I'm gonna deck her. Equal rights, equal fights. No. Equal rights, equal fights. Like I hate that term so much, but I understand.
You hate that term, and I hate the term feminism. That's not a fair dismissal of either of those ideas, so I don't care.
Like what you guys are going for.
If you understood, I don't think this video would be being made, but go on.
Should mean that like you can call the police and the police will be like, hi, yes, yeah, she's a piece of shit. You're not a monster. It's okay. Oh, you had to restrain her. That's okay.
I probably, if she is a piece of shit, she is not going to merely allow me to call the police. And it's not merely going to be a matter of restraint. This assumes that men in general have this strength and this ability that they may not have in a lot of these situations. At the end of the day, if you have someone, a skeleton like myself, who is not built on muscle and not built like a brick house, I cannot afford to try to run away. My bones are very brittle. It is very easy for someone to hurt me. So why is it my responsibility in a dangerous situation to run away as opposed to defend myself? Especially when, if the situation is that dangerous, I strongly doubt I'd have the ability to just run away. This sounds akin to people who say, well, if you're in an abusive relationship, just leave. As if that is an ability that you can just do. As if you have the freedom to do so. And I'm not saying there are no abusive relationships where you can't. I'm saying that in an abusive relationship, if one could merely leave, I would doubt how abusive it was. Usually, in an abusive relationship, the person being abusive does not give you that freedom. And the entire point is to take away as much freedom as possible for whatever crazy reason. So I don't think that this option is as easily accessible as you make it. And I don't see it as preferable to defending yourself. Stated another way, if I saw someone else attacking someone, I'm going to stop them. So if I have every liberty to stop someone from attacking a third party, why don't I have that same liberty to stop someone from attacking me?
You know, the next step should be restraining. Once you have a woman slap you and then you punch her in the face, give her a black eye, and you try to call the police and be like, I'm the victim, it just doesn't look right.
Whether it looks right or not is not relevant. Whether it is right or not is what's relevant. And for some reason, you seem to care more about what it looks like than what it is. If she slaps me and I slap her back, but she gets a bruise, am I the one in the wrong? Regardless of how it looks, I genuinely want an answer. Is that right? If you hit a man and he hits you back, is he the bad guy? Because I don't think that he is. And at the end of the day, I also think this is a severe downgrade because it's not merely slapping. Every situation cannot be mitigated to that. There are some situations where stabbing is involved. There are some situations where guns are involved. There are some situations in which various sharp, dangerous objects are involved. And I see no reason why I have to try to put them in some sort of restraint hold while they're trying to kill me. I can't defend myself. I can't knock her out and neutralize her as a threat, because that would make me look like the bad guy. I have to consider what would make me look like the good guy and the bad guy, but she doesn't have to do that. She gets to just be crazy and try to stab me. And I just don't see how that's fair. Like I said, if this was a different situation and this wasn't involving oneself, this was involving someone else, and you walk by and see someone hit someone, you're going to try to stop them. You're going to try to restrain them, but you're also going to try to stop them to prevent them from hitting the other person. You are not going to run away. And in a lot of situations, you're not going to be able to merely restrain them. You're going to have to do more than that.
For anybody. Like, for anybody. You know what I mean? It's like my best friend even. If my best friend were to slap me in the face and then I were to, like, deck her and the police were come and be like, I'm the victim, they'd be like, did you really have to do that? Or could you use other, forms? Did you...
Whether or not you have to is up for debate depending on the circumstance. Given the circumstance you suggested, yeah, you didn't have to, but if you slapped her back, that seems consummate. and it seems fair, and you could take a couple of slaps to trial, but I strongly doubt that you would. At the end of the day, it is bad for your friend to expect that she can hit you and you won't hit her back, because then there are no immediate consequences for her actions. She will be emboldened, if not enabled, and will continue to do so. To not defend yourself, whether you intend to or not, to not defend oneself, particularly from a crazy person, is to tell that crazy person that you are fair game to be assaulted. And that is not a message you want to send. At the end of the day, regardless of how the police perceive it, if someone hits you, they are in the wrong. If you defend yourself, you are not in the wrong for defending yourself. And I do not understand how you can look at someone who defended themselves when they were assaulted and say that they are just as bad as the person who assaulted them. But we'll get to that.
Try to restrain her first. Did she have you in a spot where like you had to deck her and that was your only way to like get out of that situation? You know?
Why are the police interviewing you? Shouldn't they be talking to her? And why did she slap you in the first place? And when they realize she has no good reason that she's the one that goes to jail, why are we focusing this heavily on the victim? I believe this is what some people call victim blaming, where instead of focusing on the person who committed the crime and how terrible it was, you look at the victim and go, you shouldn't have done that. Here's what you should have did in hindsight 2020, which is what you seem to be doing.
You know, I seen a video of a guy who had been trapped in the bathroom, and this girl had a taser, and she was like raping him. She was attempting to rape him. And that is like a perfect situation where you have to deck her and you've got to get out and you got to call the police because like that's your life. This person's got a taser. You know,
despite the threat level you presented, I don't understand why the level of crazy would be any different. So if your friend slaps you for no good reason and is presuming to fight you, presumably you are in equally as dangerous a situation. They are not merely going to let you leave, and they are not merely going to allow you to restrain them. They are going to continue to try to assault you. And I don't see why you have to try to run away from that situation as opposed to neutralizing the threat as soon as possible. Rape is a really extreme example, not that it doesn't happen, but it is a very extreme example. I just don't understand why you use an extreme example when this could easily be applied to a relatively smaller, more moderate example.
But I don't believe that equal rights, equal fights means, you know, your girlfriend gets aggressive with you and so you can just go ham on her.
But that's not the message being said, and you know that's not the message being said. So why are you arguing against a message that no one is saying?
That's not what that means.
And you know that's not what that means. And you know no one is saying that. So what is this video?
That's not what it should mean. Nobody should be violent towards each other and or violent towards somebody and then, you know, still try to classify themselves as the victim. Because
if someone tries to rape me and then I have to enact violence against them and I am still the victim in that scenario. But based on what you said, that's not what I should do. And I'm not trying to be hyper semantic. I'm not trying to nitpick at points. But it really sounds that way. And if we're going to argue against points that we know nobody is saying, I could just as easily do it just like you are. I know that's not what you meant, but that's what it sounds like, so that's what I'm going to argue against. How does that seem fair of me?
So, you know, we've learned this in like middle school that, you know, two wrongs don't make a right. And
did we? Because I don't think that we did. Perhaps you did, and you had a special education to do so, but not everyone did, and not everyone had that luxury of learning that. Some people are in situations where they can't tell a teacher because the teachers don't care. Some people are in situations where they can't tell their parents because their parents don't care. Some people are in situations where they have to defend themselves. And that's who I think this message is primarily aimed at. That's who I think we're primarily talking about. And for some reason, you seem to be telling those people that if you're being jumped, by multiple people, it's your responsibility to try to restrain them all or run away, because 5 people trying to hurt you are absolutely going to let you restrain them and absolutely going to let you run away. And I'm not saying that anytime anyone does anything hurtful to you, you should go for the throat. I'm saying that you should be allowed a consummate response. You should be allowed to respond in kind. If your girlfriend is aggressive to you, that doesn't mean you get to go ham on her, but you should be allowed to be aggressive back, as long as that aggressive does not involve anything physical, assuming that she didn't do anything physical to you.
And once you do it back to somebody, you're just as bad. But
are you? Are you really? If that guy had fought the woman that tried to rape him and knocked her out, would he have been as bad as she was? Because I don't think he would have been. If your friend randomly slaps you for no reason and severely injures you because she's wearing rings and you slap her back, are you as bad as she is? Because I don't think you are. This seems to be, like I said, a prime example of victim blaming. You seem to be taking power away from people who are victims and giving them less options, less power to change their circumstance. That they have to just run away or restrain the person. And if they can't run away and they can't restrain the person, then they basically can't do anything. And I can't imagine a more hopeless message to send someone in an abusive situation.
But there are, like I said, lots of situations where like you need to like deck that person to get out of your way. I've seen...
Again, you make it sound far more easy than it actually is. And I don't think that you don't know. I don't think that this is out of ignorance. I don't think that you don't understand. I think you understand how a fight works. And I think you understand that the person in the fight will not leave you alone until you do enough damage to them, unless you fight them off. And it's not going to be as easy as restraining them or running away. Most of the time, those are not going to be options in a fight. And in a fight, you should be allowed to defend yourself. But men aren't allowed to get into fights. Because if they get into fights, then they can't. If they get into a fight to defend themselves, they can't claim to be the victim. If you defend yourself in a fight, you are as bad as the person fighting you. And I don't even know how you made that connection. I just don't. This is not 2 countries engaging in nuclear war where you're just killing a lot of people. That's not the same thing as you getting into a fight with your friend who's drunk and trying to fight you because they think they can fight anybody now.
Situations where guys are being jumped by a group of girls. That, again, is a perfect situation. You've got like 5 girls against you. You need to like knock some heads and get the fuck out of there. But
what do you think? It's like, okay, knock some heads, as in defend yourself. So you're in favor of self-defense because you're either in favor or you're not. And if you're in favor of people defending themselves when they're attacked, none of this makes any sense. And if you're not in favor, then you are trying to victimize people, whether you intend to or not. So which is it? Because I'm confused at this point.
But then you call the police, right? It's about the steps that you take.
No one said that they wouldn't call the police after they knocked the crazy bitch out, just that we would knock the crazy bitch out.
I had a conversation on Instagram with a young man tonight who said, who was arguing with me about how, that phrase is perfectly fine. And he tried...
It is perfectly fine.
To use the example of like, well, my girlfriend, she used to push me, and so I'd push her back, and everything was fine. And I explained to him, like you were just as bad. If your partner
just as bad. Okay, so my partner stabs me for unreasonable reasons, and I, being stabbed, do not have the means to run away, nor do I have the sufficient strength to restrain the crazy person with the knife. And my only option is to grab the nearest object and stab them back so that they will leave me alone. No, I can't do that. That makes me just as bad as the crazy person. Someone breaks into your house and tries to rob you and holds a gun to your head. If you manage to get the opportunity to turn the tables and turn the gun on them, you can't shoot. You can't defend yourself. You have to restrain them. And I don't see any reason why you have to when they didn't. I don't understand how that's fair or how that's equal. Like I said, as much as it might seem like it, I'm not saying go for the throat. Your girlfriend punches you, just kill her. No. I'm saying if she punches you, You are well within your rights to punch her back. And I don't see any problem with that. But you do, because that looks bad. But how it looks is irrelevant to how it actually is. And I see no reason why a person defending themselves is as bad as the person attacking them. And if that's not what victim blaming is, then I don't know what victim blaming is.
Becomes physical with you. The answer isn't to evoke it back. It's
two things. One, whether or not it's the answer depends on the circumstance and the situation. But based on that, which leads into the other thing, sometimes you don't have a choice. In a fight situation, that option is not available to you. You don't have a choice as to whether or not to evoke violence against them or just run away. And honestly, to suggest that people can sometimes mitigates the actual threat. If your guy or girl or whomever is trying to fight you and beat the snot out of you, just get up and walk out the house, or just put them in a submission hold and restrain them. It's that simple. It's that easy. When I think you know good well, it's not. You should be encouraging people to defend themselves as much as possible, not to go for the throat, because no one's saying that, and you know no one's saying that, but to defend themselves as much as possible. And restraint is going to have to encapsulate incapacitate, which is going to have to encapsulate violence. And I don't think that that violence is as bad as the initial violence. What's the point in teaching self-defense classes if people ought not to defend themselves? Why bother? Why bother having any self-defense classes at all ever if you should just run away or restrain the person? Because those are the only two options when the person's trying to hurt you physically.
to leave. And, there are lots of people who are, I understand the cycle of abuse 100%. I was abused, but I wasn't decking him in the face back. I wasn't, doing things like that. So I'm not saying.
Oh, so what? Just because you didn't do it means that other people have to not do it? I don't see what your personal story has to do with anything. You say you understand the cycle of abuse, but are against abuse victims defending themselves in dangerous situations. There are times in abusive situations where the abuser is trying to kill you or going to kill you. And you argue that we shouldn't defend ourselves because at the end of the day, that makes us as bad as the person trying to kill us, which makes no sense at all.
If you're abused, leave, and if you don't, that's not what I'm saying, because I get it.
You say you get it, but you assume that the option to leave or restrain is freely available when in fact it might not be. And that's my biggest problem. Not that this addresses the idea that you shouldn't take violence to the maximum if given the opportunity. I have no problem with that. But you seem to not be addressing all of the middle ground states. And the handful of examples you said where you can deck someone and run do not actually give credence to the danger of those situations. You're surrounded by 5 women. They're not going to let you run away. It's not that simple. It's not that easy. Anyone who's been in a fight knows that the person you're in a fight with isn't going to merely let you run away. And depending on the circumstance of who that person is, you might have to re-engage them later. So you can't always run away every time you get into a fight. It's not that easy, and it's not that simple. And right now you're making it sound that way, even if you don't intend to.
But what I'm saying is, if you're with somebody and their road is to become physical with you, the answer is to leave. The answer is to say, I'm not going to tolerate this.
How does leaving demonstrate that I'm not going to tolerate that? Because not responding in kind and not defending myself to a crazy person might seem indistinguishable from just not tolerating it, or just tolerating it, rather.
I deserve to not be hit just as much as I shouldn't be hitting you as a woman. That is.
You say as a woman, but you earlier said that nobody should be hitting anybody. So I don't know why you brought that point up.
Equal rights. It just.
Is that equal rights? The scenario described was a woman took a frying pan to your head, and your response was, I'm not going to take this, I'm leaving. At which point, she promptly just let you walk out of the house and everything was fine. When in reality, she probably would have then tried to bust your kneecaps. Again, threats don't just go away and aren't always so easily restrained and detained. And I don't like that those are the only two options you're giving potential victims. I really think you should be empowering people to take self-defense classes, to carry mace, to carry tasers. If you would have said, carry a taser with you in case someone does that so you can tase them, which effectively incapacitates them, and you've defended yourself without going too far, I fail to see what the problem is. But that's not what you did. You encouraged them to either restrain or run away, assuming they possess the ability to do either of those things, which they may not. Not all men are built like a brick house, and not all women are not built like a brick house.
It makes me cringe when I hear equal rights, equal fights, because it's just all I hear is like equal rights, equal fights. And I'm like,
what you hear and the message being put across are two different things. Now, if you did not understand what the initial message was, and this is all you heard, this would make perfect sense. This video would make perfect sense. But as you said in the beginning of the video, you know good and well what people are saying. You know what they mean. You know what the message is. And for some reason, despite you knowing that and agreeing with it, you're just like, I don't like the way it sounds. Change it. And that seems like a frivolous concern when we're talking about people's equal rights, to complain about the way something sounds to you, or you and the people who agree with you, not all of whom are women.
It just sounds like men who just want to hit women.
I don't care what it sounds like, and I don't see why you care what it sounds like when you know that's not what it is. At the end of the day, is it my responsibility to tailor every single message I put across to a hyper-specific degree that nobody can ever possibly take it in a negative way? Or is it my responsibility to put across the message and then clarify my point? I don't think feminists have to change feminism because it just sounds like women want to rule the world. Just because it sounds that way doesn't mean that's what it is. And it's other people's responsibility to try to discover what it is and not judge it based on merely what it sounds like. But I don't like the way feminism sounds. It sounds like women trying to take over the world. So I'm not a feminist now because of that. Because that is a good reason and a valid objection to feminism as a title.
And that's how it sounds to us, because when we think of equal rights, we think of so many things. Because, 100 years ago, women were at such a different place with their rights.
What does that have to do with the conversation we're having right now? If we're talking about equal rights right now, and you're like, well, in the 1990s, not even in the 1990s, what am I saying? In the 1900s, 100 years ago, this, that, and the other thing. Which that is a moot point, and that's a moot point because you're discussing the past, something we can't change and over which we have absolutely no control. Regardless of what the current situation is now, the past will always be exactly what it is. So why are we bringing it up? And I'm not saying that that necessarily means there's no valid reason to bring up the past ever, but why are you bringing it up here?
Whereas guys, you guys think about, like I said, the right to not have violence evoked against you, which is 100% valid.
I find it interesting that you gave a timeline for women's rights, but not a timeline for men's. I find that very interesting and notable, but putting that aside.
Because that is where...
And yes, I'm aware that I'm over my 2-hour time limit, but I really want to finish this, and we're very close to the end, so we're just going to keep going.
Your oppression has lied greatest, and that's...
Still not convinced that any gender is oppressed just because you said so, but go on.
Like 100% valid. But I really think we need to take away this equal rights, equal fights, because it's just cringy.
So we need to take away an important message for equal rights because it's cringy. Not because it's bad, not because it's wrong, not because it has inaccuracies or it's propaganda or it communicates a bad message that people don't understand because you clearly understand. No, because it's cringy. Should we also get rid of feminism because I and many others think it sounds cringy? Or is that just a really, really stupid reason to get rid of a label?
And it doesn't actually open the door for conversations.
That seems to be exactly what it's doing right now, unless you don't consider this a conversation regarding the topic.
It just, the first thing women think of is, oh, so you just want to hit women?
That sounds like their problem, not mine. If I tell you I'm a feminist and the first thing you think of is an SJW, that's not my problem. It's not my job to go through your head and debunk all your biases. That's your problem. Those are your biases. Those are your preconceived notions that you have to deal with. Why are you making those things my responsibility?
And then guys have to explain, no. And then there's, you know what I mean? Like,
guys have to explain. If guys explain things, how is that not a conversation? How is the scenario you described not a conversation, not opening the door for conversation? The only way I could see that not being a conversation is if the woman isn't listening, because the man is most definitely talking, and he's most definitely listening because he understood that he needed to explain. So he's listening and talking. The only way this could not be a conversation is if the woman isn't listening, which is not on him or whomever is spreading the message, because this isn't exclusively about men and women, despite the way you phrase this or frame it.
It's just not really good for anybody. Equal rights means accepting equal responsibility.
And part of accepting responsibility for hitting someone should encapsulate the expectation that they defend themselves. Right?
I think that is a lot nicer. I think it's...
Whether it's a lot nicer has nothing to do with whether or not it's the correct message. There are a lot of things that a lot of people don't think are nice, but don't then necessarily need to be taken away or relabeled or are bad or anything. Again, there are a lot of, let's say, sexists, misogynists who are very much don't find the idea of feminism to be nice. That doesn't mean feminism should just stop. That doesn't mean egalitarianism should just stop. That doesn't mean humanitarianism should just stop because some people are pieces of shit and they think it doesn't sound nice.
It's a lot easier to say, and I think...
Easier for who?
That it's just a lot more thoughtful, and it's showing that you're a lot more aware as to how far women have come.
Why is it my responsibility to be thoughtful of them, but not their responsibility to be thoughtful of me? If you hear equal rights, equal fights, and you think you just want to hit women, that is not you being thoughtful towards me. But then it is my responsibility to elaborate and correct you and explain my position in a thoughtful manner. How is that equal? How is that fair? Women get to have whatever reaction they have to something, and then men have to correct it. How is that equal? How is that fair? I don't understand. I don't understand why it's my responsibility to be thoughtful, but you get to think whatever you want, and then I have to correct your thoughts and your biases. You have a preconceived notion that me defending myself means men are just going to start hitting women. And because you have that idea in your head, I have to tailor my messages to the biases that you have. Explain to me how that's fair. Your biases are your responsibility, not mine. And I don't consider tailoring your message to the potential biases people have as thoughtful.
When it comes to...
Also, how far women have come has nothing to do with this conversation. This is about people defending themselves. And how far women have come has nothing to do with people being able to defend themselves in situations where they defend themselves from someone else.
You know, really the fight for equality. It was like not even, I think it was like 60 years ago or something, that you could still like legally rape your wife. Like that's pretty fucked up.
Is that the case now? No? What does that have to do with the conversation? Doesn't matter if it was 60 years ago or 600 years ago. If it were 600 years ago instead of 60 years ago, would that make my point better? Would that make my point worse? Would that make your point better? Would that make your point worse? Because I don't think that it would. So I don't get it.
So, you know, the women's suffrage was 100 years ago. This is 100 years ago.
Yeah, we're discussing, whether or not people should be allowed to defend themselves from a social point of view, which is why we're discussing the women's suffrage, because that's relevant somehow.
So, it's just not that long. And so,
Even if it was that long, I fail to see how that would bolster your point or diminish it. I don't see the relevance at all.
putting something like equal rights beside a word like equal fights, it's just really inconsiderate to what our society has gone through and how far we've come. And keep in mind,
Inconsiderate? That has nothing to do with anything. That's, as far as I can understand, this is an opinion and not a well-formed one at that, because you just said this is just what women think of. Not that this is something that they've critically analyzed, not that there's something that they've critically thought about. This is their reflex. This is their intuition. This is their bias. And it's my responsibility to account for that instead of their responsibility to work on their biases. How is that fair? When women fight for equal rights, they don't have to account for men's biases. They don't have to account for the way they sound. You didn't have to account for the way you sounded when you made this video. If I said that I didn't like the things you said and I thought it was inconsiderate to men and everything that men had been through, would you then just rework the entire video for me? No, because your message presumably is going to be valid regardless of my feelings towards it, and vice versa.
your mothers, your grandmothers would have been a part of that.
I don't care, because this isn't about them. This is about defending. This is about everyone being allowed to defend themselves. This isn't about the women's suffrage and how far women have come from and equal rights as it pertains to women. This is about equal rights as it pertains to everybody. And for some strange reason, you don't seem to be focusing on that. Your primary focus in this video has been women, not men, women. You occasionally mention the men, and sometimes you agree with them, but it's mostly about women and how they feel and how our messages have to be tailored to their feelings and their biases and thoughts rather than the actual facts of what's happening. My family is not relevant to whether or not I should be able to defend myself if a woman or a man strikes me. If I get into a fight, I'm not going to go, man, well, let me think. Women's suffrage was 100 years ago. Should I defend myself? Should I? No. And if I'm putting out a message that others should defend themselves, I'm not going to go, well, should people defend themselves? Well, the women's suffrage was only 100 years ago, so maybe they shouldn't. And at the end of the day, that's the message. That's the topic of discussion. And if that's not what you're talking about, we're not discussing the same thing. You are talking about something that you know good and well no one else is talking about, which you are free to do, but don't act like that's representative of that point. Don't act like that's representative of the message. Don't act like you're actually talking about the same thing that I am when you know you're not.
And so I just want you to really keep that in mind. I think that we should just remove equal rights, equal fights.
No, you want us to remove equal rights, equal fights basically because you don't like the term. As far as I can tell, that's it. That's the line of reasoning. You don't like it. It sounds cringy. The women's suffrage was 100 years ago, so this sounds inconsiderate to that fact. Therefore, remove the term. And I can make a bunch of badly semantic arguments against the word feminism, but that doesn't mean that you have to rename it because I made a bunch of poorly worded arguments against feminism. I don't care what the label is. I care what it does. And so should you, and so should everybody. But if you're so hyper fixated on labels that you just can't get past your bias about a label to get to the actual message and topic being discussed about people defending themselves, that sounds like a personal problem you have to work on and not anyone else's responsibility to work around. Excuse me, be considerate of. Well, that's all I can stand of that video. And I know I've gone over my usual limit, but I really wanted to address this last video. So anyone who sees this now, in the future, whenever, let me know what you think. Comment, tell me your thoughts. I assume if you like it, you will subscribe and like if you do. But genuinely, let me know. I'd love to have a conversation on this topic and love to hear what other people have to say. It's not that hard to glean how I feel about the subject, so I'm interested to see other people's perspectives on it. Until then, I will see you guys next Sunday. unless a video that I'm planning comes out sooner than I want it to. But most likely I will see all of you guys next Sunday. Have a very, very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and all of that good stuff. Until then, remember, I appreciate you.